we're going to discuss subleases. And so, what we're looking at here are the best practices, certainly legal considerations. Number one, can we even do a sublease? And so, we're looking at the language in the lease, we're looking at whether or not the recapture rights or sublease and assignment clause language will, in many cases, what we're looking for is this landlord approved, or is this going to be or is he going to not withhold reasonable? Oh goodness, I can't remember what that is. What is that, Nathan? It will
But
be
yeah,
not
most of the times it'll
unreasonably
say can't be
withheld.
unreasonably would be withheld. And then I try to always put in or negotiate a time limit. If I'm negotiating a lease, we need a response within 15 days, 15
Right,
business days or whatever.
right.
Because some people, not often, but people can just drag it out for some reason.
Yeah, very much. And on top of that, I'm working on one right now, and it's a $750 fee just for the landlord to consider the due diligence and the financials on a potential subtenant. Right away, you're paying 750, you've done the marketing, you've hired a broker, and you're paying the broker directly here, and you're paying for the marketing. And then you're also paying the landlord just to look over the financials of a potential subtenant. And in many cases, to your point, you want to have a timeline there that they need to respond by. And also there needs to be some specific reasons if they are going to reject the tenant that would not allow the subtenant to step in and subsidize your contract. In many cases, finding out right away is that will we take a sublease assignment? Can we help you? Sure. The first thing though is what? I think we probably need to see the lease.
Yeah,
So that
person.
trust needs to exist right away because that is the first and foremost and most important part of can we even do this before we all get started. And so a lot of that is on the lease language, whether or not it's going to be something that the landlord will look at and not be unreasonable about, or if it's something where it's his full discretion. There are hoops there. And when we're talking about sublease, we're looking at a sublease and assignment clause provision. We're looking at the recapture rights. And then that leads into certain ways that they would deal with any kind of profit sharing should that arise, which in office is not the case. And that's where we're starting. So if you're engaged and you're speaking with a potential client, Nathan, and they want to talk to you about a sublease in general, what are you looking for? At what point does the term remaining on that sublease really, where's that point where the size would make sense there, or you could find a user in that sweet spot, that 5 to 7,000, where we think we have more users out there that could take the 5 to 7,000 square foot space versus a half floor or something like that'd be a little bit trickier
Yeah.
to lease and perhaps a shorter term. So, but what are you looking for just in general if we're going to make the assumption that legally, per the letter of the lease, you can go ahead and sublease? What are you looking for in terms of, marketability, ideal kind of size range, term remaining? How do those things impact what your thought process is?
Yeah. So I think the first and most important thing is going to be the amount of term remaining. As far as size, there's going to be different users for spaces all the way from 2,000 square feet all the way up to 7,000. Once you get to, like you were saying, a half a floor or a full floor, the amount of businesses that are going to actually lease out something like that are few and far between. I think the amount of term is the most important thing for me personally that I look at. And ideally, I would like to see a year left for a couple of reasons, right? So first, it's just going to take time to get it subleased. If we could put something on the market and get it subleased or leased out the next day, we I could retire it already. But realistically, it's probably going to take between 4 to 6 months, depending on the quality of the building, the price point that we're at, the area that we're in. If we're over in the energy corridor, it's probably going to lease out a lot faster than something like an office condo out in the burbs in Cypress or in Katy. So that's what I look at. Anything shorter than 6 to 9 months, we could still look at subleasing and marketing, but that's when an assignment probably becomes a more realistic solution.
Yeah, it's obviously a late stage sublease, harder to move, right? Less term. You're not going to necessarily be enjoying that discounted rate for very long before there's the need to negotiate a direct rate. So oftentimes that results in a blended rate where we're taking however many months are remaining of the sublease, and then at the sublease rate, and then you'll have a direct rate that you'll do with the landlord. And because that's where you need to go get your TIs and commit to some term there, because most subleases are going to be without any kind of tenant improvement allowance. And so you're really taking the space as is and having to come in and take a space as is in many cases is so you can take maybe a little bit more than you need because the discount will offset some of the inefficiencies of the space, but you are getting it in many cases for such a discount that it makes sense for you. There are certain buildings and they do exist. Most of them are in the Memorial City area. There's several that are in the Upper Kirby area, and these are trophy assets, Class A plus, where again the bifurcation goes on with no end in sight. If we're in the office business and we're an attorney or we're a group that's going to be client facing, financial services, et cetera, we're looking at a trophy space if we're going to have a footprint. That does lead to sometimes where if there is a sublease in a building like that's highly competitive, that's high in demand, these newer buildings, you will see some of those subleases move very quickly. Surprisingly, the sublease space as a percentage overall of the total office space in the market, it's only 2.5% in the whole city, which it seems like it certainly did after COVID. But it seems like it's more than that. It's really not. Right now, it's a healthy inventory in terms of sublease space. So your ideal kind of user, what I'm looking for is being able to accurately guide a prospective client or the client on here's where your line, your X and Y axis are going to cross, right? So this is the inflection point where we're going to have that haircut that you may be a little uncomfortable with initially, but we're also losing money by the month if you're not willing to understand that the more aggressive you are, and I'm not saying you're giving it away, but at the same time, any delusions of grandeur of getting 95% on the dollar of your contract rate is not the best way to go about it in this office market. Again, unless you're in one of those trophy buildings. So most likely, if you have, let's say, an ideal amount of term left, right? So 5 years, something like that. Four, less than 5 years, but I'd say 4 years and more than 18 months, just because you get a little tight there. In that ideal range where you're able to have plenty of time to enjoy the sublease rate, I think in those cases, 65, 70%, again, depending on a number of other factors, but just for discussion's sake, a haircut along those lines. And I think that's a realistic starting point just to set expectations and to do what you'd be hired to do here is actually sublease the space. That's where I approach the subleases as more of it needs to check a few boxes before we can accurately advise our client and really guide them and manage expectations. It's when we go into the situation where we're absolutely dead certain that they are not going to take a discount, and then it just becomes a kind of a lost cause. Once we get into some of the, in terms of actual marketing the space, let's say you get hired. Let's say that it's something where it's in that range I talked about. It's an ideal term remaining. It's in that 5,000 to 7,000 square foot. It's a nice space, right? We got offices along the glass. You've got some open area. You have good building, good amenities, good location, et cetera, right? And so you have nothing there that is going to be terribly prohibitive at all to getting a nice tenant in there. It's a nice space at a discount and everybody wins. What are you looking for in terms of marketing, and how do you go about finding that ideal subtenant?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different ways to market things, and some folks will do the same thing as every other shop, right? We'll put it on CoStar, LoopNet, Crexy. We'll do the standard, but what I find is been the most successful is direct marketing to potential users. That's where I found the most success in fulfilling subleases. So there's a number of different ways that you can do it. I'll just use SIC codes. I'll look at the building itself, what I in my brain envision all the different potential users could be for this space. And I'll just go through and I'll put together a list of surrounding businesses in the area, say 5 miles, right? Something at least in Houston, 5 miles, depending on the time of day, that could be 10-minute drive or it could be a 20-minute drive. So I typically cap it there. And I'll find a list of typically anywhere between 1,000 to, I've seen it as high as 3,000, 3,500 different
Sure.
businesses or different points of contact at these different businesses that we think are decision makers. They're either in some sort of authority, they have some sort of authority to be able to make these decisions for these companies, and reach out to them directly.
Yeah.
That's been the most successful thing for me.
It does give us the opportunity to really go low tech, right?
Yep.
Which I'm a big fan of these days. And we're really stacking buildings, boots on the ground, taking an office building from floor to floor and letting every tenant there know that you've got a sublease coming up, and that especially you have adjacent, you're looking at rights to, I probably should mention this quickly, in terms of the space rights, if there's a ROFR on the property, right of first refusal, if there's different claims to that space, there's a number of those things to work out. But let's just assume that you can identify the types of users that are already in the building, that it would be a logical fit. Usually you can look through a tenant list and identify that pretty quickly. You can shortlist those fairly quickly and see who the ideal fits are. The thing with obviously not having a tenant improvement allowance to move in as the subtenant is not ideal. So you are taking space as is, but in many cases, the use and the build out of the tenant is really now who we're targeting, right? If it's a law firm and it's built out for law firms, then
It's going to be a shorter putt.
there it is. 2 + 2 does indeed sometimes equal 4. Perfect. Those are ideal subleases for me, and having an internal network of a lot of attorneys and being able to go and to contact national offices and to say, hey, look, you guys, I know you talked about a little while back opening an office up in Houston, didn't know internally what your timing looked like, but this may or may not impact that. And it's an opportunity to move into a good building, good part of town. You guys had circled that area before. But if you wanted to come in, this is a nice entry point to come into the market now to sublease at a good space, already built out, tastefully done, ideally.
Yeah, below
So,
market rate, which is what I think one of the biggest appeals
yeah,
of the sublease, and also the trade-off of why you're not going to get, in most cases, why you're not going to get a build-out allowance or a whole lot of free rent, right? It's a trade-off of being able to come in, like you were saying, 70% below where the market is.
yep. Yeah. And it's very much, and maybe it's a misconception, but it's very much it's in terms of listing. And I'm compared to having listings with office, industrial, retail buildings. It's a very active marketing process, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's active. You really are. It's a lot of boots on the ground, pounding the pavement, knocking on doors, old school prospecting. And
It
and so that and just using whatever tech tools you have to blast any number of ideal tenant profile that you would put together that would make them say no to this space, to the rate. And a lot of times too, we're trying to understand what their objections might be before we present the actual sublease to them. And so a lot of times that does mean that we need to be very familiar with the terms of the lease, because what it does mean in a sublease situation is that your tenant is still going to be responsible contractually he's going to be responsible for the terms of the lease. The subtenant, yeah, he'll come in and he'll subsidize the rent, but it is a tenant that is ultimately responsible, that ultimately can be found in default, that ultimately their name is on the lease, they're responsible for the lease. So when we look at that type of situation, in some cases you have groups that are moving away, or they're going to be out of business, or they're not going to be exactly a group that is going to be following up as diligently, perhaps on the performance of the subtenant in paying rent on a month-to-month basis. If you've got a 5-year sublease in there, you're probably not going to monitor like a hawk your subtenant that's subsidizing your rent just because you're moving on with your life and whatever that looks like. So in some cases, it makes perfect sense to, if we're not going to just sublease the space, it makes perfect sense we look at a buyout, or we will look at an assignment more than anything. And have you done a lot of assignments? Have you gotten into that? I know we went assignment heavy for a while there. It felt like we were in assignments, up to our ears in assignments for about a 6-month period.
Yeah, I've done a couple of assignments up at the North Houston area, Woodland Spring.
Yeah. And so explain a little bit about what goes on there and maybe some differences, or what, if you're going to look at that for your client, where does it start to make sense? Where does the assignment start to make sense? And just high level, right? It's a assignment. We're signing the terms of the contract over to the subtenant, right? So as we mentioned before, where the sublease scenario is one in which the tenant would be responsible for the lease. Now we are foregoing the responsibility. We are assigning all responsibility over to our subtenant. So now they're taking on the full lease, all provisions, correct?
Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. Maybe 3 years ago, yeah, up in the oak and forest and woodlands area, I helped a client that needed about 11,000 square feet of office space for an accounting department. And we were looking at potentially subleasing some different space, doing a direct lease at a couple of different spaces, and we found a sublease that the tenant had less than 2 years left on their lease, and the rate that they were paying was below market. And so it made more sense for us to do it made more sense for us to do an assignment and extension with the landlord directly and take on their lease obligations for the remaining, call it year and a half, and then do another 3.5 year extension with the landlord.
Sure.
Because they had some pretty favorable language in that lease, right? For their renewal options, they said, okay, renewal can't be more than 10% higher than what the finishing rate was. And they were already paying a below market rate. My clients wanted to keep that. They wanted to
Yeah.
keep that language.
Yeah. I would too. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
Who
yeah,
wouldn't?
you don't see that language in there very often. I had a 90% of fair market value at the termination of the primary term the other day in a lease, and I hadn't seen that in a while. So not only do they have their extension option, but they were able to begin negotiations at whatever they determined 90% of fair market value was. So you just don't see those very often.
I think a lot of assignments is just case by case, right? What makes
Absolutely.
the most sense for the client themselves, and how does that relate to what's in the parent lease or the lease that the current tenant has with the landlord? Is there anything in there that's advantageous to our clients or somebody that's looking at going in and leasing out a space or potentially subleasing space?
Yep, that's right. And when you do get a situation where maybe the sublease is not the answer or an assignment is not the answer, but now you're looking at a potential buyout situation, you're looking at the lease termination of the buyout. We're always running through our models. And for some reason, I've noticed that we do at times like to model at 10% of the remaining obligation and as a lump sum payment as a buyout. And so I guess I've not been fortunate enough to be in many situations where the landlord was just fine taking 10% of what they were owed.
Yeah, I don't see that.
In many cases, when I have been involved in buyouts, it's more than 10%. But you will find sometimes that they will certainly listen, and it just depends on the circumstances. We had a lot of very, very different circumstances for about a 2 year period from 2020 to 2022 in terms of these types of situations, being able to get away with some of the type of deals and buyouts and early termination. A lot of these things were, I think, probably the only time in my lifetime that I've seen tenants where they were able to almost get out of the remaining obligation in a way that was not just contractually punitive. And since then, we're back to normal. And those are things that you're looking for when we're trying to present the full picture and the full scope of options to a group that comes to us rather, and wants a sublease. Again, to recap, number of things we need to look at. Can the tenant sublease? How restrictive will the landlord be? There's also language in there as well that if the subtenant or if the tenant goes to the landlord and wants to sublease some space, the landlord also has an option at that point to terminate the remaining term of the tenant's lease. So not only could he take your money in theory, that $750 I mentioned earlier, they could take that and then decide as well, you know what, we're going to go ahead and decide to terminate your lease. If you're needing to sublease, you can just terminate your lease and we'll go direct with another tenant. That seems to be something where those kind of boxes need to be checked to make sure we can go ahead. And then we get into a little bit of what works, what doesn't work, and how active we need to be with actually marketing these spaces and moving them. I've always had good luck with kind of finding a lot of groups reaching out if you're really aggressive with your outreach, and then being able to turn some of those requirements into future deals down the line and to, develop relationships, get to know groups that reached out, and sometimes 3 or 4 years later circle back just based on one little bit of outreach if they were interested in a sublease back 3.5 years ago. That's where the kind of the quality of the space and that type of user, and then your ideal client, your ideal kind of subtenant to go in there, all those things really play a part to me in the holistic approach to looking at it beneficially from a brokerage point of view. It does bring about new tenant rep opportunities for sure. So, and I know subleasing is exciting. I think you and I both agree that it is a small portion of our overall business in general. There's a lot to know there, and it's not something that is maybe as cut and dry as public perception is. There's a lot that does go into that, and a lot of options that perhaps a lot of groups didn't know they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is something that as a broker, you will inevitably run into, especially doing tenant rep. You're going to or help tenants go into different spaces, and inevitably some of those tenants are going to call you and need your help to sublease the space. So I don't want to turn that down. You want to do right by your clients, and yeah, it's always helpful.
You mentioned it earlier, but any kind of portfolio work, right? When you were working with the same group and they've got multiple locations, multiple assets, what have you, inevitably there will be a sublease assignment of some sort as they attempt to consolidate. Maybe they're all consolidating from different markets, so all getting under one roof in the same market, whatever it may be. Inevitably, the word sublease does come up, right?
Yeah.
It seems
So you got to know about
to
it.
follow.
Yeah, you have to know about it.
All right. I've said my piece on subleases for today. You have anything left to add here?
I think the only thing that I think it's worth making a big point about is just that subleasing is not going to remove the original tenant's liability. That's something that can be confusing to subtenants, right? If they're looking at subleasing their space and we find a subtenant, that's not, we're done. We're not, you still have an obligation, and it's not going to release your liability to your original lease, to that parent lease. And that's something that could cause a lot of heartache down the line. If you don't understand that, I just think it's worth being aware.
It is. And it's also why that's very important to look over the quality and the financials and everything you can uncover and get to know about the potential subtenant, right? Because in some ways you are in a bit of a partnership there in a sublease arrangement. And so it does obviously behoove you to do some extra due diligence and to find out if we have past delinquency issues, any types of financial issues that you need to be aware of prior to a company coming in to supposedly save your bacon. And then turns out I've had a sublease. I forgot about this in Post Oak. I've had a sublease of a sublease.
No kidding.
Yes. And we're not gonna. That's for a subleasing part 2.
Yeah, it's like the sublease hydra.
Yeah, we'll cover that next time. It's a very interesting case study.
Yeah. But other than that,
Hey, it's good to
that's all
see you,
I got.
Nathan. I'll talk to you soon, bud.
All right. Sounds good.
Take
Have a
it
good
easy.
one.